What if the only man who could save her life was also the one man she was terrified to trust? The dust in Cedar Hollow clung to everything. It settled on the roofs, the wagons, the church windows, even the breath in the air. The town sat in a narrow cut of the Montana mountains, where shadows gathered early and the cold hung around long after the calendar said spring. The railroad was coming through the valley, and the sharp cry of steam whistles now mixed with the church bell each morning, a sound that felt less like progress and more like a warning. Eliza Hart felt that warning each time she walked from the small room she rented to the old barn that served as the school. She was only 24, but her quiet way of moving made people think she carried decades on her shoulders. After her father died, she taught children by day and mended shirts at night, scraping together what little she could. The debt he left behind to the Cedar Hollow Bank and Trust hung around her neck like a stone. Mercer Hale, the man who ran both the bank and much of the town, made sure she never forgot it. He was the kind of man whose smile looked kind until you saw his eyes. Then you understood there was nothing warm behind them. Eliza knew he had trapped her father with smooth talk and poison ink on a loan paper that stole their land out from under them. She knew it, yet she could prove none of it. His latest idea was a matchmaking social at the church, a righteous name for something far uglier. The bachelors of the territory were invited to, quote, the debt-burdened women of Cedar Hollow. Everyone knew what it really was. A quiet auction. A way for Hale to tie women like her into marriages that kept their land and labor in his pocket. When he told her she was required to attend, the fear in her stomach turned sharp. That same afternoon, a man rode into town. Jonah Creed. People spoke his name in low tones, half afraid he might step out of the shadows and hear them. He lived alone in the high country, a man worn by cold winds and hard years. He carried scars across his brow and down the side of his neck, pale marks that hinted at old violence. He spoke little when he sold his furs, paid for supplies, then vanished back into the mountains. Eliza had seen him before from a distance. He moved like something carved out of the land itself, quiet and steady. She never imagined his path would cross hers in a way that would change everything. As Jonah stepped out of the general store with his box of ammunition and a sack of flour, he heard noise from the church, forced cheer, nervous laughter, men crowding near the door, women being ushered inside like livestock. He saw Mercer Hale at the entrance, smiling that false smile. He meant to mind his own business and leave town before nightfall. Then he saw her. Eliza Hart stood near the steps, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. There was no shine in her eyes, no spark, only quiet dread. When Mercer touched her arm, she flinched. Jonah saw that tiny tremor, and for reasons he could not name, something inside him shifted. He turned his horse toward the church. Inside, the air felt thick. Men filled the pews, shifting with restless eagerness. Women who owed debt stood at the front, their futures laid bare. When Eliza's name was called, she stepped forward with the slow, numb steps of someone walking toward a cliff. Mercer Hale introduced her to the crowd as if she were a fine item to be traded. He spoke of her teaching, her good upbringing, then slipped in the mention of her father's debt. His voice was smooth as oil. The bidding began. A rancher, a shopkeeper, a man with drink-swollen eyes. Eliza stared at the floorboards and prayed for the world to swallow her. The church doors crashed open with a blast of cold air. Jonah Creed stepped inside. Whispers rippled through the room. Men leaned back. Women gasped. Jonah walked straight down the aisle without looking left or right. He stopped before the preacher, then before Eliza. For a heartbeat, neither of them breathed. He reached into his coat and placed a heavy deerskin pouch on the table beside the preacher. Gold dust spilled out in a thick stream. "I will cover the debt," Jonah said, his voice low but carrying through every corner. "We will be married." Quote, The church fell silent. Mercer's smile cracked into something cold and hateful. "This is a charitable social, Mr. Creed," Mercer hissed. "There are procedures." Jonah looked at him, and the look alone made the banker step back. "The debt is paid," Jonah said. "The woman chooses." Every eye in the room turned to her. Eliza looked at Jonah Creed, a man with a dangerous past and a reputation she did not fully understand. But she saw no hunger in his eyes, only certainty, and something she could not name. He was not offering her a perfect life. He was offering her a way out. "I accept," she whispered. The vows were spoken so fast she barely remembered the words. Jonah offered his hand when it was done, rough, calloused, steady, and for the first time in months, she felt a breath of air fill her lungs. When they left the church, Jonah helped her onto his horse and said only, "Hold on." She did. They rode into the mountains, the cold air cutting across her face, Cedar Hollow shrinking behind them. She was leaving everything she had known, riding beside a man she did not know. Fear and hope tangled inside her. Hours later, when the cabin came into view, solid, sturdy, warm against the dark forest, she felt something loosen inside her. She was not safe yet, but she was no longer trapped. That night, Jonah slept on a wooden bench, giving her the bed without question. He spoke only enough to ask if she needed food, water, or a warmer blanket. He did not touch her. He had bought her freedom, but he did not claim her. For the first time in a long time, she closed her eyes without fear. Something was changing. Slow as thawing snow, quiet as the mountain wind. And neither of them knew what storm was coming next. The mountain mornings came cold and clear. Eliza woke to the crackle of the fire Jonah had built and the smell of pine smoke drifting through the cabin. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet. No church bell. No railroad whistles. No men calling out bids for her future. Only the deep stillness of Elk Trace Pass. Jonah moved around the cabin with silent steps, careful not to disturb her. When she sat up, he nodded once, as if to ask if she had slept. She nodded back. They were strangers living under one roof, tied together by a vow spoken in fear and desperation. Yet his presence did not frighten her. He gave her space. He spoke little. He touched nothing she claimed as hers. In those first days, she watched him with cautious eyes. He rose before dawn to chop wood, feed the horses, and check his traps. His movements were steady and sure. He was a man shaped by the land, patient and careful. She could not understand how a man like that fit with the brutal stories people told about him. Still, she kept her guard up. She cooked simple meals, swept the floor and folded blankets to keep her hands busy. Jonah lived on the bench beside the window. At night he slept there without complaint. It should have felt strange. Instead, it felt safe. The first time she laughed in months was on the fourth morning. She tried to start the fire on her own and filled the room with thick, gray smoke. Jonah stepped inside just in time to see her coughing and waving a small tin plate in the air. He took the flint from her hands and rebuilt the fire with calm, efficient motions. His lips almost curved, not a smile, but close. After that, they fell into a rhythm. He showed her which plants near the creek were safe to eat. She showed him how to mend a tear in a shirt without leaving a stiff ridge in the fabric. They spoke little, but every day the silence felt less heavy. One afternoon, while Jonah was outside splitting logs, a figure appeared on the trail below the cabin. A tall man on horseback. Eliza's breath caught until she saw him lift a hand in greeting. Jonah relaxed. It was Nate Walker. He dismounted with an easy smile and greeted Jonah like an old friend. When he saw Eliza, he tipped his hat with a respectful nod. "Good to see a bit of sunshine up here," Nate said warmly. "Jonah, you finally brought someone decent to this mountain." Eliza felt her face warm. Jonah pretended not to hear the comment, but Nate winked at her anyway. He stayed for coffee and brought news from the valley. Most of it made Eliza's stomach twist. "Mercer Hale is telling folks you were dragged up here," Nate said quietly. "Says Jonah forced you, says you're being kept against your will." The words made Eliza's chest tighten. She shook her head firmly. "That is not true," she said. "I chose to come. Jonah paid the debt. He saved me." Nate nodded, believing her at once. "I know, but Hale is stirring up trouble. A man with money and fear behind him can rattle a whole town." When Nate rode off, Jonah watched him disappear into the trees, his jaw tight. The peace on the mountain felt thinner now, as if danger was creeping up the trails. A week later, they rode into town for flour. Eliza felt every stare. People whispered behind their hands. Some stepped away from Jonah as if he carried sickness. A few muttered that she should not be riding beside a killer. Jonah ignored every comment, but Eliza felt each one like a stone thrown at her back. The worst came when she saw the poster nailed to the general store wall. A wanted notice. A $500 reward for Jonah Creed for the crime of abducting Eliza Hart. Signed by the territorial marshal. Requested by Mercer Hale. Her knees went weak. "It is a lie," she whispered. Jonah tore the poster down with one sharp pull. He crumpled it in his fist and dropped it in the dirt. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something deep and cold. "We go home," he said. The ride back to the cabin was silent. A weight settled between them. The world below had reached up the mountain to drag them back into its trouble. That night, long after the fire burned low, Jonah stood outside, staring into the dark woods. Eliza watched him through the window. He looked like a man waiting for something he could not see. Something he feared might already be coming. The next morning, the danger showed itself in a sharp crack of gunfire. The bullet splintered the doorframe. Eliza jumped back, her heart slamming against her ribs. Jonah grabbed his rifle and pulled her to the floor behind the table. "3 of them," he said, peeking through the window. "Riflemen. They think they can pin us in." Eliza's hands shook as she crawled across the floor. She was not a fighter, she was a schoolteacher, but fear had a way of turning people into something new. She reached for the rifle Jonah had taught her to use. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. Jonah looked at her with surprise, but he did not stop her. He trusted her. She crawled to the far wall where a small gap between logs gave her a narrow view outside. The forest was a blur of dark shapes and shifting shadows. She aimed at the ground near one of the attackers, just as Jonah had taught her. She fired. The shot echoed through the valley. The man dove for cover, shouting in panic. It was enough. Jonah fired next, his bullet striking one of the attackers and sending the others scrambling deeper into the trees. But it was not over. A third man charged the cabin. The bullets tore through the air. Jonah fired, but his aim faltered. A shot ripped into his shoulder. He staggered, dropping to one knee. Eliza's heart cracked open. "Jonah!" He forced himself up, his jaw clenched. He lifted his rifle with one arm and fired just as she fired again. The man fell. The forest went still. Jonah's rifle slipped from his hand. His knees buckled. Eliza caught him as he fell. His blood soaked her hands. His breath came in sharp, broken gasps. She pressed her palms to the wound, but the blood pushed through her fingers. Her blouse tore under her desperate grip as she ripped it open, using the cotton to make a bandage. She pressed it to his wound with shaking hands. His body leaned into hers, hot with pain. His forehead pressed to her shoulder, his breath against her neck. "God help me," he whispered. Outside, the forest was silent again. But the true danger had just begun. The cabin was a blur of motion as Eliza worked to save Jonah's life. His blood was everywhere, warm and frightening on her hands. His breath came fast and uneven. She steadied herself, forcing her shaking fingers to move with purpose. She boiled water, cleaned the wound, and stitched it shut the way Jonah's mother's journal described. Her eyes burned, but she did not stop. She would not lose him. Not now. When she finished, Jonah's face was pale but calmer. He drank a small cup of water, leaning back with his good arm. "You did well," he said quietly. "You taught me," she answered. Those words changed something between them. Not with a kiss or a promise, but a look. A long, deep look that held bravery, fear, and something softer. For 2 days, Jonah fought a fever. Eliza stayed at his side, cooling his face with damp cloths and whispering to him when he tossed in pain. Sometimes he called out for his mother. Sometimes he called her name. When the fever finally broke, she cried in relief, her forehead resting against his good shoulder. But the mountain was no longer safe. The wanted poster, the attack, the lies Mercer Hale had spread, all of it had reached up into the high passes, and more danger was coming. They needed help, and they needed the truth brought to someone who could challenge Mercer's power. That moment came when Eliza found the hidden board in the cupboard. Behind it lay a thin ledger and a stained letter. The letter was a confession from Abel Morris, the quiet accountant who had worked at the bank. His words were shaky and desperate. He wrote that Mercer Hale had stolen federal money meant for struggling families. He wrote about false loans and poisoned medicine. He wrote that Eliza's father had been slowly murdered so Mercer could take his land. Eliza's hands trembled as she read. Her father had not died from sickness. He had been killed. Jonah read the letter in silence. His jaw went tight, and his eyes turned dark with a cold anger. This was no longer only about saving Eliza. It was about justice, truth, and the life her father had been robbed of. Nate Walker and Mrs. Lynn both helped decode the ledger. Each number and mark pointed to Mercer's crimes. Each page was a piece of the truth Cedar Hollow needed. Judge Harrison, a fair man with a strong sense of right, was coming to town in 2 weeks. They had to reach him. But winter came back with a furious storm. Snow slammed into the mountain. Wind tore at the cabin. The horses were in danger of freezing. Jonah and Eliza fought the storm together, pushing through the deep snow to keep the animals moving and protect their supplies. They dug a pit under the cabin floor for food. They worked until their faces went numb. When the storm finally eased, they were both worn. But something new had grown between them. Respect, trust, a quiet love that neither had spoken out loud, but both felt in the space between their breaths. That night, by the fire, Eliza asked about the Kellerman feud. Jonah told her the truth. The night of fire. The fight he never wanted. The lies that had trapped him on the mountain. She touched his scar gently and said, "You are not the man they say you are." His eyes softened in a way she had never seen. When the storm passed, they made their plan. Eliza would take the ledger through the old Black Snake mine shaft, a hidden path that led behind the livery near town. Jonah would create a distraction at the rail yard to pull Mercer's hired guns away. Then she would reach Judge Harrison with the evidence. It was a desperate plan. But it was their only chance. Jonah held her face in his hand before she entered the shaft. "Be careful," he said. "I will," she whispered. She climbed into the darkness. The tunnel was cold and wet. Water dripped from the ceiling. The path wound like a snake. But she kept going. When she reached the far end and saw daylight, her heart surged. Jonah's diversion had begun. Gunshots echoed through the valley. Smoke rose near the rail yard. Eliza ran. She reached Judge Harrison and told him everything. She placed the letter and ledger in front of him. He read them slowly, his face turning hard. He believed her. He wrote a warrant for Mercer Hale's arrest on the spot. But Mercer had already turned the town into a frenzy. He claimed Jonah had bewitched her. He gathered a mob and told them she was a prisoner. The crowd roared with fear and anger. Nate Walker stood in front of the hotel, blocking them with only his voice. "She is here by her own choice," he said. That single moment kept chaos from turning deadly. By dawn, Judge Harrison had Mercer Hale in chains. They found the original ledger hidden in the bank safe. They found poison bottles matching Abel Morris's story. The truth was out. Mercer Hale's grip on Cedar Hollow was broken. But Jonah and Eliza still had to face one more danger. Vincent Kellerman. He and 4 men ambushed them in Black Snake Canyon, blocking the path. Vincent stood with a pistol aimed at Jonah's chest, ready to finish the fight that had begun 10 years ago. Eliza stepped off her horse. She stood between Jonah and the gun, her hands open, her voice steady. She spoke not with anger, but with understanding. She asked Vincent where revenge would lead. She reminded him of the boy he once was. She asked him to choose a different ending. The canyon fell silent. Then the mountain itself spoke. A rock slide crashed down, blocking the path and shaking the ground beneath their feet. When the dust settled, Vincent lowered his gun. The fire in his eyes dimmed. "She is right," he said quietly. He and his men turned and left the canyon. Eliza and Jonah climbed the last stretch home. That night, the cabin lights glowed like a beacon on the mountain. It was no longer just shelter. It was theirs. Weeks passed. The town healed. The lies were buried. Justice was done. Jonah was cleared by law and by truth. Eliza grew strong in the mountain life. Jonah grew steady in the warmth she brought. One day he set a small silver ring in her palm, made with his own hands, forged from the quiet hope he had found in her. "I want to marry you the right way," he said. "Yes," she whispered. Their second wedding was small, warm, and filled with true joy. A life began there that would last through every season of the mountain. Months later, at dawn, Eliza stood on their porch, one hand on her growing belly, watching the sun rise over Elk Trace Pass. Jonah brought her a cup of coffee and wrapped his arm around her. They watched the world wake up together, a safe home, a clean sky, a future bright as the morning light. Their story had begun with fear, danger, and a torn cotton blouse. But it had become something far stronger: love, trust, and a life built with their own hands.